Richard Nixon Presidential Library and explores the life and career of our 37th president.
Okay, how's that? Is that reading light hitting anywhere that you can see? I don't think it is. I got a barn door locked, but it might.
Okay. Hey, you're better looking than I am. Why don't you stay here? Blondes, they say, photograph better than brunettes. Let me see, did you get these lights properly? Yes, my eyes always have, you'll find if you get past 60, that's enough. Thanks. My friend Ollie always wants to take a lot of pictures. I'm afraid he'll catch me picking my nose. He wouldn't print that, would you, though, Ollie? Yeah. Now, you can take a long shot, but that's enough right now. I guess I can see it. Oh, you want a level, don't you? Yes, yes. Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of our nation. Need any more?
That's Richard Nixon on August the 8th, 1974, as he prepared for the live television broadcast in which he would tell the nation he was resigning the presidency. You'll see more of this rare video later in our program. We'll also take you live to the newest member of the Presidential Library System, the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. You'll meet its director, Tim Naftali, and see this unusual room that houses life-size statues of world leaders most admired by President Nixon. Before meeting Tim Naftali, joining us as always for this series is Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian, George Mason University scholar in residence. How are we going to focus on Richard Nixon?
Well, broadly speaking, we're going to concentrate on, in the first hour, on foreign policy, particularly the openings to China and Russia and Vietnam. And then in the second hour, we'll look at Watergate and the events surrounding the end of the Nixon presidency and beyond. Needless to say, that's not the whole story. I mean, one thing that should be set up front, although we don't have a lot of footage relating to this, there's been a lot of very interesting revisionist scholarship in recent years from people like Joan Hoff and Melvin Small and others who suggest that the Nixon domestic policy record deserves much more attention than has gotten. If you think of things like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Philadelphia Plan of Affirmative Action and revenue sharing and wage and price controls, Nixon was an activist president on the domestic front, which ironically makes him in many ways a president without a party today, because his brand of activism and expanding government is, needless to say, out of fashion with modern conservatives.
If this is the first time you've seen any of these series of programs on the presidential libraries, this is our 7th. There are 12 presidential libraries under the National Archives and Records Administration here in Washington, run by Alan Weinstein. We ask our special guest every Friday evening here, Richard Norton Smith, to steer this search for treasures in the libraries, hidden treasures, things that people haven't seen. These programs are not meant to be from start to finish on the presidency. Tonight we have some special footage we'll show you as the program goes on, shot by Bob Haldeman, Chief of Staff to President Nixon. We have some secret recordings, and we'll learn more about that in a moment. And then there are some new oral history interviews that Tim Naftali has done, and we'll show you some excerpts from all that. But first, let me introduce you to the new director of the President Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, Tim Naftali, who's standing among a group of people that he can explain to us who they are. Evening, Tim Naftali.
Hello, Brian. Good evening, Brian. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the World Leaders Gallery here in Yorba Linda at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. In July of this year, the National Archives and Records Administration inherited a museum that had been conceived and built by the private Nixon Foundation. Richard Nixon was alive when this museum was built, and one of the things he wanted was this depiction of those leaders who, quote, he said, had made a difference. These are leaders that he had interacted with throughout his long political career, and they're here for you to see. They're life-size. They look like they're made of bronze. They're not quite made of bronze. But in a sense, they are representative of the kinds of human leaders that Nixon interacted with throughout his career.
Who are the two right in front of you there?
Well, these were perhaps, if you had been thinking about Richard Nixon's career in 1950 and you had wondered who were the people he was least likely to meet, it would have been Zhou Enlai, Premier of the People's Republic of China, and of course, Mao Zedong. Nixon is most famous for his trip to China in February of 1972. In the 1950s, the United States government had refused to recognize the People's Republic of China, that had been created in the late 40s. Indeed, when the United States and the People's Republic of China engaged in negotiations regarding the future of Indochina at the Geneva Conference in 1954, the Secretary of State of the United States, John Foster Dulles, refused to shake hands with Zhou Enlai. Well, Richard Nixon was vice president at that time, and perhaps it wouldn't have been predicted that he would ultimately shake hands with Zhou Enlai, but he would in 1972. In the late 1960s, one could see hints that Nixon, as he was thinking about running again for the presidency, was changing his ideas about China. He felt that bringing China back into the international Commonwealth of Nations and making it a U.S. partner, not an ally, was key to a successful end of the American involvement in Vietnam. So in mid-1971, he shocks the nation and the world by saying, I will go to China. And then in February of 1972, he goes. But one of the wonderful parts of the story is that he went not knowing whether this man, Mao Zedong, would meet with him. Mao was very ill by this point. He had congestive heart failure. He was bedridden. He couldn't stand. But he wanted to meet Nixon. He, like Nixon, understood the symbolic value of this meeting of the two titans, if you will. So he had his doctors pump him up, prepare him for this meeting. And at the moment that Nixon's Air Force One landed, it was still unclear to Kissinger and Nixon whether Mao would meet Nixon. The feeling was, if this visit happened without that meeting, it would not be considered a triumph. But when the plane landed, Mao sent word that he wanted to meet Nixon, and within 3.5 hours of Nixon's arrival in China, on the beginning of an 8-day visit, he was meeting in Mao Zedong's secret villa, and they actually spent an hour together.
Tim Naftali, we want to show the audience some film that you've had there at the Library and Museum. Could you set it up for us? This is Bob Haldeman and his Super 8 film. Where does it come from, and why do we see him in the film?
It's an amazing thing. April 30th, 1973, Haldeman and Ehrlichman resign. When the FBI goes into Ehrlichman's office, they find in one of his compartments 204 rolls of Super 8 film. Now, people of a certain generation will remember Super 8 film as the kind of film you use to film your children's birthday parties. And when the National Archives and when the White House started to look at these films, they noticed people's birthday parties. 4 members of the White House staff, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Larry Higby, and Dwight Chapin, all used this Super 8 camera. Each had a Super 8 Bell & Howell camera, which they used not only to film their children's birthday parties, but they also used to film, if you will, a back-scenes look at the Nixon administration. Haldeman, who was chief of staff to Nixon, had been an ad man. In a sense, if you've watched the show Mad Men, you'll understand Haldeman's worldview. Haldeman believed in the importance of image and in pictures. And he wanted to record for himself and also for the government the Nixon presidency. So these films were actually developed by the Navy. They were not privately owned. They were, from the beginning, government property. They were developed by the Navy, made into small compilation reels, and there are about 23 hours of these films, some of which are private. We've actually returned to the families.
Richard Nixon Presidential Library, and explores the life and career of our 37th president.
is it? How's that? Is that reading light hitting anywhere that you can see? I don't think it is. I got a barn door off, but it might.
Okay. Hey, you're better looking than I am. Why don't you stay here? Blondes, they say, photograph better than brunettes. Let me see, did you get these lights properly? Yes. My eyes always have, you'll find if you get past 60, that's enough. Thanks. My friend Ollie always wants to take a lot of pictures. I'm afraid he'll catch me picking my nose. He wouldn't print that, would you, though, Ollie? Yeah. Now, you can take a long shot, but that's enough right now. I guess I can see it. Oh, you want a level, don't you? Yes, yes. Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of our nation. Need any more?
That's Richard Nixon on August the 8th, 1974, as he prepared for the live television broadcast in which he would tell the nation he was resigning the presidency. You'll see more of this rare video later in our program. We'll also take you live to the newest member of the Presidential Library System, the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. You'll meet its director, Tim Naftali, and see this unusual room that houses life-size statues of world leaders most admired by President Nixon. Before meeting Tim Naftali, joining us as always for this series is Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian, George Mason University scholar in residence. How are we going to focus on Richard Nixon?
Well, broadly speaking, we're going to concentrate on, in the first hour, on foreign policy, particularly the openings to China and Russia and Vietnam. And then in the second hour, we'll look at Watergate and the events surrounding the end of the Nixon presidency and beyond. Needless to say, that's not the whole story. Climb onto Air Force One and watch on a monitor press coverage of the very same departure ceremony in which they were featured a few minutes before.
We come out of the back of Air Force One, and he's up there taking films of everybody. But he took them everywhere, and he wanted to create this great library of the Nixon years, and he was taking them of all these wonderful places he had been and seen, I think, and all the history they were part of, and he wanted to. But every time he was on a trip, he brought it along with him.
One of the real highlights of the Haldeman footage is the historic trip to China in 1972. Here we are on Air Force One on the way over, and we see some footage that's pretty historic itself. Bill Rogers and Henry Kissinger together, talking in a relaxed fashion with the President of the United States. Kissinger, for his part, had a very prickly relationship with Rogers, whom he regarded as vain and not particularly competent. And it made for a very tense, very uncomfortable, ongoing battle, really. Some of it institutional and perhaps unavoidable between the White House and the State Department, but greatly exacerbated by the personal dislike and almost contempt, I don't think it's too strong a word, that these two men felt for each other. And Nixon was really in the middle. Nixon was also preoccupied with documenting his presidency. You know, it makes sense that someone like Haldeman, who was perhaps the most important person, certainly the person closest to the president, would spend the amount of time and put the amount of effort that he did into visually documenting the Nixon presidency. I think there was also an understandable concern that Richard Nixon was not seen by most Americans as a touchy-feely, warm, charismatic figure. And there was a great concern, presumably beginning with the president himself, that the White House needed to do a better job of communicating his humanity, his warmth, his ability to write to average people. And what better person to do that than your chief of staff? The footage in question is a great metaphor for a presidency that is, in fact, obsessed with images. with how it's being presented, with how it's presenting itself, and with how it is being received, both by the press elite and by the general public.
The TV coverage was just incredible. And the anchors went, and all the big shots. I remember Eric Severide was there, and all of them, all of the Bigfoots were there, and John Chancellor. It was a great crew. Barbara Walters was on there. This world had been closed for 30, 40 years to the West and to the Americans, and here they were seeing this on television. And here were these, our worst enemies on the earth. And we're down, when we first went into the Great Hall of the People, they're playing Turkey in the Straw and God Bless America, the Chinese People's Army Liberation Band. It was just, it was remarkable. It was just riveting. You're in another world. I'd been in Moscow before Nixon went there in '71. Beijing made Moscow look like New Orleans. And we waved to the folks, and just, there wasn't a single emotion, anything. They're just looking at us, going by. Nobody waved, nobody moved or did anything. People were doing their exercises early in the morning. There were bicycles. Tiananmen Square is a gigantically open place. I don't know any place in America is that open, sort of, and paved and everything. And very, very few cars or anything. You're just in another world there. If you see the Great Wall, if you got the right picture, the big picture, I'm behind Nixon in this big, in this Russian hat that I got in Moscow. We walked up the top of the wall and we walked back down, or up to one of those parapet type things, and we walked back down. But it was a photo op. We were well aware of that. I don't even know if Joe and I and those fellows went up there with us. This was a little tour thing with us, but it was extraordinarily impressive.
Back home, Haldeman also picked up his camera to document some incredible scenes around the White House and downtown Washington as war protesters enveloped the city twice in 1969, at one point forcing the administration to call in the military. In fact, here you can see an amazing scene. These are administration officials who are, in fact, on top of the White House watching this demonstration, a threatened riot, as it is occurring all around them.
I worked on Saturday, went down to get another pack of cigarettes in the cigarette machine in the basement, and as I told somebody, I ran into the 82nd Airborne. It wasn't the 82nd, but they were airborne troops. They had their paratroopers' boots on, and these kids were ready for action. But what we did is they had buses, a gigantic ring of buses, all the way around Lafayette Square and all the way around down to E Street, virtually around the entire White House, so the huge crowd couldn't get over. Now, this was the time in October and November that one of them, they had 5,000 of them broke off and trashed the Department of Justice. That's when John Mitchell made his famous statement, "I thought it was the Russian Revolution." But it was enormous, and we had helicopters up there and doing the grid thing, and they were talking about 500,000 and 600,000 there. And that's when Nixon delivered his great silent majority speech between those two demonstrations.
You have to understand that this was an administration at war, that this was a country, in a sense, at war with itself. And I think that footage illustrates pretty dramatically the state of siege that Nixon and his administration felt that they were experiencing. And in a curious sort of way, there's a symbiotic relationship between those waves of protesters and the perhaps paranoia that they generated inside the Oval Office. It's always unusual when we get to peek behind the curtain. I'm not sure whether someone on the White House staff would shoot this kind of footage today. I'm not even sure in the era of the special prosecutor whether we would have this kind of record. It's not just a written record or diaries that presidents no longer keep. I'm not sure they would take the risk of documenting the visual behind the scenes history of their presidency. So this is a unique record in many ways, particularly given the buttoned-down nature of the Nixon presidency. That this was a presidency that was so carefully scripted, or at least tried to be in so many ways, that to see this kind of footage, well, it's a record unlike any other. And I think it has a historical value that probably will only grow with time.
From the home-like video shot by Bob Haldeman and others at the White House to the replica of the East Room there at the Yorba Linda-based Presidential Library of Richard Nixon. It's bigger, though, than the actual East Room by about 20 feet. Tim Naftali, who is the director of that library, has something in front of him that's called the image memo. We're talking about images in this last segment. Explain to us what you have there.
Richard Nixon loved the dictabelt, loved the dictaphone. And at one point in December of 1970, he dictated an 11-page memo discussing his image. So it wasn't just Haldeman that was concerned about his image. The president himself was concerned. And this passage, I mean, there are several phenomenal passages in this particular document, but this passage says a lot. I speak first of the simple idea of warmth. I don't mean by that we want to get away from the fact that the president is reserved, dignified, etc. But there are innumerable incidents of warmth which have not come through. Now here I want to emphasize a point which will go against what Sapphire would like. Everybody wants me to sit down and talk to members of the staff in a puffing way about how nicey nice I've been to members of the staff. That is not the way to do it. If warmth is to be believable, it must be discovered. And at this stage, there are many examples. This is quite a remarkable document.
That memo, we have the entire memo, 11-page memo, on our website you can find. And also, don't forget that the website of the Nixon Library has a lot of other things that you can see. But Richard Norton Smith, when you hear this memo and watch this footage, what comes to mind?
Is this extraordinary interior conversation that Richard Nixon is having with himself. And the great irony is he despises most of the instruments, the great media outlets, for example, that are going to be projecting his image and interpreting his image. It's remarkable. And also, you know, here is someone who has achieved the objective of his lifetime. It's an extraordinary thing that people in the Nixon White House are spending as much time worrying about how they may come across as opposed to simply getting on with the job. Can't imagine Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower doing it.
Tim Naftali, for years, this network has dealt with John Taylor, a familiar figure to our audience, or Kevin Cartwright, or Sandy Quinn, and lots of others out there at the Nixon Library. Where are they today, and how did you find yourself in this job?
Well, they still are involved in the Nixon Foundation. John Taylor, the Reverend John Taylor, is the executive director of the foundation. Sandy Quinn is one of his assistants. How did I get this job? Well, Lord only knows. I come to this job as a historian. I'm nonpartisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm an independent. My interest in presidential libraries is that they be a meeting place of ideas where people can learn about history, learn about important periods in our history, discuss, debate, and disagree. So for me, it's a privilege to be here. I can't imagine a more controversial and more interesting presidency than that of Richard Nixon.
Your background includes Yale and Johns Hopkins and Harvard, where you got your degrees. Where were you right before you took this job in April of last year?
Well, I was the director of the Presidential Recordings Program at the Miller Center of Public Affairs, which is at the University of Virginia. So I'd had some experience working with Nixon tapes, although most of our work was with the Johnson and Kennedy tapes. What I learned from that, though, was a sense of the pace of presidential life. One of the things that people, outsiders, don't understand, and really you begin to understand when you hear tapes, is the number of responsibilities that crash and jumble together for a president every day. He, and maybe someday she, does not have the luxury of just thinking about domestic policy one day or foreign policy another. These issues come to them all at once. So it gave me an incredible sense of how complex a presidency can be, and I suppose was good practice in preparation for this presidency.
Earlier today, I had the pleasure or interest in watching what we're about to see that comes from oral histories and also video histories that you have recorded yourself. Tell us a little bit about that project, and then tell us about this story, which I had never heard before, that Dwight Chapin tells.
Oh, well, first of all, I haven't done these myself. I mean, I did most of the interviews, but of course there's a team of people helping me, and I have involved some outside historians for some of the interviews. But here was the objective. If this library had been established in the normal course of events, in other words, just after the president left office, they would have done an oral history. Somebody would have done an oral history, but of course this library wasn't established until long after Nixon's death and over 30 years after the end of his administration. So I felt it was necessary to rush and to try to get on tape, on broadcast video, the reminiscences of the key people in the era, not simply Nixon veterans, but also those who mattered, like Charlie Rangel and Elizabeth Holtzman and John Kerry. So we've done 41 up to now. We plan to do at least another 30. And this is a way of bringing to life that era for kids primarily who don't really know these players, don't know the issues. And I think the way people learn these days is through YouTube and through an interactive experience. And for me, that was the way to do it. That was the way to bring documents and the other wonderful materials of the presidency to life. It was to get people like Dwight Chapin, who we'll hear from in a moment, actually describe what they did. Now, Chapin was deputy assistant to the president. Chapin was part of the University of Southern California mafia that really plays an interesting role in the Haldeman operation. He, like the madman, he goes into the advertising business. He's an advanced man as a young man. He's a baby boomer. And what happens to this man is that he begins to acquire more and more responsibility, and he's around Nixon. He sees a lot of Nixon. He's with Nixon right next to him throughout the 1968 campaign. And what we're about to hear is a story that's never been published, never been described anywhere, and frankly, if we didn't have an oral history with Dwight Chapin, we'd probably never know about it. And it involves an improbable relationship between Richard Nixon and Martin Luther King Jr.'s family.
Here's what I remember. I remember this incredible tugging and pulling. Does he go to the funeral? Does he not go to the funeral? Does he go to the funeral? Does he not go to the funeral? Nixon's gut thing was, I don't go to the funeral because it's not credible. I mean, I don't, yes, he's a national leader, but I don't like taking advantage of going to a funeral and being there when Martin Luther King and I were not good friends. We flew. It was myself and Mr. Nixon flew to Atlanta. Nick Ruey picked us up at the airport, and he had hired a guy, kind of a limousine driver man, and paid him enough to said this can never be talked about to the limousine driver. We got in the car, and we pull up in front of Martin Luther King's Jr.'s home. We go in and we go up onto the porch. It was a very modest home. And here were all of his children, and Mr. Nixon talked to each one of them and expressed his condolences. We then went down the back hallway and into a bedroom, and laying on the bed with her propped up on pillows was Mrs. Martin Luther King. The president went over and sat on the side of the bed. By the way, he wasn't president. The candidate went over, sat on the side of the bed, took her hand, and started talking to her, and I left the room. And I went back up with the kids. And I would say that Mr. Nixon was in there maybe 5 minutes. Then he came back out, talked to the kids a little bit more. We got into the car, and we drove over to Martin Luther King Sr.'s home. And he went in, he found Dr. King Sr. and Mrs. King, expressed his condolences. We were only there, I would say, 10 or 15 minutes. Got in the car, went back to the airport, got on the plane, and went to the Key Biscayne Villas and Hotel in Key Biscayne, Florida. Bibi Rebozo had met us at the airport, drove us over there. So now it is, let's say, 7:30 at night, and I'm in my room. I had actually a little villa, kind of, I'd say 30 yards from Nixon's. And I get this call. He says, "Dwight, can you come over?" So I go over, and he's there with Bibi Rebozo, Jane Lucky, who was Bibi's girlfriend, and Nixon. There three of them are sitting on a couch. It was like a surreal thing. I mean, watching some television show. And he says to me, he said, Dwight, how's our trip to Atlanta playing? And I said, sir, I have no idea. I'll go check. So I go back and I called John Whitaker, who had been the point man on putting all of this together with Nick. And I said, John, I think we've got a problem. Mr. Nixon is asking how it's playing. John says, what the hell do you mean? He said, this whole thing was to be off the record. Nobody was to know. And I said, well, he's asking me about, how it's playing. I think he thought it was going to leak or something. So he said, you better go check him and see what he wants to do. So I go back and I said, Mr. Nixon, nothing's happened because you had wanted to have this confidential and nobody was to know. And he got furious. He said, damn it. He said, I'm going to have to go back there and go to that funeral if this is not, the whole purpose in our doing it was so that we would do it privately, we were not taking advantage of it, and we would not have to go to the funeral. So I went back, called Whitaker. Whitaker called Nick Ruy. Nick Ruy started calling radio stations saying, I think I saw President Nixon here, or former Vice President Nixon here visiting the King family. The radio stations called the King home, and the King family wouldn't confirm it because they had been told that it was to be confidential, that Mr. Nixon didn't want anybody to know, and they wouldn't confirm it. So, I mean, this thing was a disaster.
Former Nixon aide Dwight Chapin telling a story I've never heard it before.
Well, first of all, that is a textbook example of what oral history at its very best is, because we all know in this town there's a lot of history that never gets put on paper. And there's a very good example that if the Nixon Library and Tim in particular had not gone out after that story, it would have been lost to history. The footnote, of course, is that that funeral was very largely organized and paid for by Nelson Rockefeller.
How do you know
Who did
that?
keep it a secret, who wanted it kept a secret, and kept it a secret.
You mean he paid for the actual funeral
Yeah,
itself?
he sent, as soon as Dr. King was assassinated, Rockefeller, who had a long-standing relationship with the King family, sent his best advanced people down to Atlanta and said, money's no object, you're there to help the King family and to organize this thing. And actually an advanced man named Joe Canzeri went out and found the wagon that was drawn, the mule-drawn wagon that people remember, of course, from the public procession. And Rockefeller said, there's one thing, though, I want it kept absolutely out of the press, and it was until now.
By the way, you mentioned it's easier for me to ask you this question than Tim Naphtali about this oral history thing. You've run the Eisenhower, Reagan, Ford, Hoover libraries. Do all the libraries expect to do this kind of thing?
Well, that's a great question. The earlier libraries did do oral histories. They had oral historians on their staff. They had a budget to do oral history, and it was just part of the program. And somewhere along the way, let's say post-Johnson, that no longer was the case. Now, the Miller Center at the University of Virginia has sort of stepped into the breach and done a lot of oral history on its own. But I think this project at the Nixon is a classic example of intellectual entrepreneurship.
The next little bit of information we're going to show you is 3 minutes and 28 seconds long, and then we're going to take some calls. So the numbers you'll see up on the screen, and you can begin dialing now. We want to get your questions or comments in. Remember, this is not meant to be an in-depth look at President Nixon or any of the presidents. It's approach we took was to look for new and interesting information to give you some idea of how you can do your own research if you're interested in getting behind the stories that you've heard in the past. What's next?
This clip, first of all, Daniel Ellsberg was a former defense analyst who in fact had been supportive of the war, turned against the war, and decided in 1971 to leak what were known as the Pentagon Papers, which were a 4,000-page government-commissioned history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The Nixon White House decided to prosecute Ellsberg, and the case, in fact, against the Times went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled 6-3 against the president, who you're about to hear commiserating in the wake of that with J. Edgar Hoover.
Might suggest you listen carefully to this.
Edgar? Yep. I wanted to tell you that I was so damn mad when that Supreme Court had to come down. First, I didn't like their decision, but unbelievable, wasn't it?
It was unbelievable.
You know, those clowns we got on there, I'll tell you, I hope I outlive the bastards.
Well, I hope you do, too.
I mean, politically, too, because we've got to change that court.
There's no question about that whatsoever. I had thought it was a possibility of a 5-4.
Yeah, you know, I thought we ought to get White. What's the matter with him?
I don't, well, of course, Wizard White is an old Kennedy crowd.
Right. Well, then the other one, no. What in the hell is the matter with Stewart?
Well, Stewart is a very wishy-washy individual. He switches from one side to the other.
Yeah.
And I wasn't surprised that on this thing he switched.
You know, one thing I was gonna ask you, a lot of people have a feeling that I ought to, not a lot, if they're all mixed as a matter of fact, some people think that now that this court has acted that I ought to make a statement about the freedom of the press and that we aren't trying to censor them and so forth. My inclination, whatever is worth, is not to say so. I'll tell you.
I think you're right.
I kind of think I should stay out. But what's your public relations judgment on it, Edgar? I'd just like to know.
Public relations judgment, Mr. President, is that you should remain absolutely silent about it.
You would, huh?
I would.
But now? You don't think that that's any great problem that they've been. That naturally been charging that we have been trying to keep the press from printing the truth about the war and so forth.
I don't think that's involved because, as a matter of fact, these papers don't harm you one bit.
No, actually, the stories in the Post and Times this morning were all about Kennedy and DM.
Kennedy, he was the one who started it, and then Lyndon Johnson escalated it, and then you inherited it, and you have brought it down. You never sent an additional man in there, but you brought it down. Yeah. And I think what they're trying to do is to bait you into taking a position that the freedom of the press ought not be to that extent. And I think we ought to be awful careful what we do in this case of this man Ellsberg. Because there again, they're going to make a martyr out of him. All of the press of the country are going to come to the front that he's a martyr. And when you what the Supreme Court has now said, I doubt whether we're going to be able to get a conviction of him. I hope so, but I doubt it. We've got a good, strong case on him. And his first wife testified very vigorously against him. And it's a good, strong case. But
I'd like to check some of the other people around him. That's the others. I think there's a conspiracy involved here.
This fellow Sheehan of the New York Times is involved. This fellow Jack Anderson here in Washington, that skunk that we have here.
Is he in it too?
Oh yeah, he's in it. He was at the Post and had copies made. I saw her on the TV last night, Mrs. Graham. I would have thought she's about 85 years old. She's only about, I think, something like 57.
Oh no, I know that.
And I had an idea she was a great deal older when I looked at her last night. She's aged terribly.
She's a terrible old bag.
Oh, she's an old bitch in my estimation.
That's right.
But I think from your point of view, it would be very ill-advised.
You don't think I should say anything?
I don't think you should say anything.
Just let it cool off. Let the papers come out and let them reflect on whoever they reflect.
What they want to print, it doesn't reflect upon you. You had nothing to do with all of this.
No, I had nothing. Nothing of it was about me, you know.
Not at all.
Tim Neftali at Yorba Linda, how many more conversations like this have we not heard?
Many. There are 3,800 hours of tapes, and we've only released 2,000. One of the things we are focusing on in College Park, by the way, the library is still divided. I have staff in both College Park, Maryland, and here in Yorba Linda. We're focusing on releasing the last cron, the last 1,800 hours of tapes. There's a lot to come. So there are many more conversations like this one to come.
Richard Norton Smith, what about President Nixon and his relationship with the media?
Well, I think it's fair to say it was tumultuous. Although, actually, it's funny, you know, they thought they got a pretty decent shake during the '68 campaign, but it really didn't last very long. And what we're about to see really reflects, again, another defining moment in the Nixon presidency. In the fall of 1969, as we heard earlier from Pat Buchanan, in between two of the great moratorium demonstrations in Washington, there's a real turning point, a fork in the road in the Nixon presidency. Rather than lose the agenda, Nixon goes up to Camp David for several days and comes down from the mountain with a really pivotal speech in which he coins the phrase silent majority, an attempt to rally a majority of cultural conservatives behind his Vietnam policy, and that in turn sets in motion a sequence of events that you're about to hear described.
What happened was the elites in the media trashed the speech uniformly. The media then was television. 2/3 of the American people got their news from network TV, and the networks had their instant analysis. And I sent him a memo, and they were saying again, write letters to the editor. And I said, we got to go after the networks. Directly, publicly use the bully pulpit, counterattack them. And I got a note at the top of my memo. It says, P has seen, go ahead. And so I write this speech, and I worked it up, and it was, and I've been thinking of it for a long time, and I send it over to Nixon. And I get a call. And so he calls me over. There's Nixon, and he's got his glasses on. He very rarely wore those. He wore those in the Oval Office. And this speech is really honed and ready to go. And he's sitting there, and he's writing little things, adding little add-ons, which I didn't want in there. And so I could feel the pain, and all of a sudden, he looks up and says, "This'll tear the scab off those bastards."
Let's take a call. Miami, Florida, you're on. Go ahead, please.
Good evening. I heard a glimpse of some of Mr. Nixon's profanity and vulgarity, but I think it should also be pointed out, and that it's often overlooked, how anti-Semitic he was. He made many, many anti-Semitic statements over the years, and he had his public enemies list. And I think very often your presidential historians like to gloss over that. I mean, Mr. Buchanan was also involved in the presidential election in Florida, and we had problems with that as well. And his cronies, Mr. Nixon's cronies, were well-known anti-Semites, and it's never reported by any of you. And one other little thing, I also note that on your screen, when you give the telephone numbers, I'm amazed to see that the Republicans are listed on the top line. They're finally out of power, and you folks don't seem to want to recognize that the Democrats now control Congress.
Tim Naftali, what do you say about the earlier comments from the gentleman?
Well, the beauty of this library is that we are completely transparent and open. On our website, when we opened in July, we posted various memoranda because they were interesting, not because they put the president in a good light or a poor light. We plan to have interactive exhibits here that show all elements of the presidency, including the personal aspects that this gentleman raised. There's no question, but there are slurs in the tapes, slurs against various minority groups. We don't take sides here. We don't say, this is what it is. If you want to study President Nixon, you have to study all of President Nixon. You can't just study the good side. You can't just study the dark side. The beauty of this library is it's completely transparent. You'll get it all here, no filtering. We're nonpartisan. We're American. Remember, the beauty of this country is we're not afraid to tell the truth about our leaders. That's what makes us different. That's why we're not like North Korea or not like Iran. And this library, like all the libraries, this library is going to make sure you will learn it all.
To the caller on the second point, we switch the party every month, so just hang in there. We'll have the Democrats back on top for you. Escoda, Michigan, you're on the air.
Oh, thanks. Glad I'm on top, Brian. Hey, well, I thought it was 001 and then 002, but what do I know, right? Hey, I do remember President Nixon as a young boy, well, teenager, and certainly his intellect was undeniable. I'm just wondering, and I don't know if you want to comment on this, but do you think if President Nixon had, say, the style, or even, should I say, the looks, this is a fluff question, I understand, do you think he could have withstood Watergate? He certainly was a dedicated man. I doubt that he slept too much. I think he studied all the time. Can you give us a little insight on him?
Mr. Smith.
Well, I don't think looks had anything to do with Nixon's election or the way the Nixon presidency ended. I think, if you forgive me, what really fascinates me, I've often said that the remarkable thing about the Nixon presidency isn't how it ended, but that it occurred at all. And I mean by that, Nixon's temperament. Nixon himself famously said that he was an introvert in an extrovert's profession. He was a closet intellectual. He was not a natural. William Safire, in his book Before the Fall, has a wonderful little vignette. They're on the campaign trail. Nixon's about to leave the plane, and Safire says, "Boy, you must enjoy this, all of this campaigning." He said, "No, campaigns are just something to get through. And that's revealing.
Chicago, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, C-SPAN. It's really nice to be able to speak with you.
Evening.
I love the program, and this series is excellent.
Thanks.
Here is my question. And this is directed to Mr. Smith, how are you, myself, our children, our grandchildren, anyone supposed to believe what is documented, history that's documented about this country when it is well known that persons like J. Edgar Hoover edited many files. He took things. He had information destroyed. He had information inserted to his liking and to what he wanted the public to know. How are we supposed to believe anything that is on film, that is memoed, that is written, that is recorded, when this man manipulated historical documented files?
Thanks.
Well, that's a fair question, but I guess I'd answer your question with a question is, maybe not a question. In the end, there was something that Hoover couldn't manipulate. It's called history and historians. The fact of the matter is that Hoover's reputation since his death in 1972 has tumbled pretty significantly. We've learned a lot of things we didn't know about Hoover. We learned a lot of things we didn't know about, or maybe only suspected, about the way he ran the FBI. The FBI is an organization that certainly has been transformed. The fact is, through a free press, through historical and intellectual inquiry, and yes, through instruments like C-SPAN, opening the windows, letting the air in, if you will. In the end, history has a way of humbling even the most powerful.
Kissimmee, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hello. My name is Garfield Washington Adams. My date of birth is March 21st, 1972. A year later, I was celebrating my first birthday with my parents, and it was March 21st, 1973, and that is the same date of the smoking gun tape with Nixon and John Dean. It was March 21st, 1972, and that was my first birthday. Also, my other anecdote, I had a cousin. He was serving in Vietnam, South Vietnam, with the Special Forces, and he was leading a group of South Vietnamese popular forces in a place called the Ruck Sack Special Zone. My cousin's name is he's Commander William Cully, like that. He served with the Green Berets, like that. And the Ruck Sack Special Zone is a place that has an escort that leads toward the Mekong Delta. And he was out there with a couple of South Vietnamese popular forces, because the Special Forces were being withdrawn because of Vietnamization. When, a North Vietnamese sharpshooter, sized him up and he was killed. He was killed in action on March 21st, 1972. That's also the day of my birth.
Thank you, caller. Tim Naftali, tell us some more about the room that you're in and other figures in the room. Who are you standing by there?
Before I tell you that, I just want to comment on the caller's point. One of the things that's really important to keep in mind is a presidential library is a point of intersection, not in one's personal history. So that people come here not simply to learn about the life of one president, but also of an era they grew up in the case of the caller, he was very young, but an era that means a lot to them, and that's important for us at the library. One of the things I hope to do eventually is not just capture the memories of very famous people from the 70s, but the memories of younger people or older people whose children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren should be coming to this library in decades to come, and will find not simply information about Richard Nixon in the 70s, but also information about their own families. I think you've got to maintain that point of intersection between personal history and national history. Now, around me, speaking of great historians and great historical figures, we have here two of the Russian leaders, Soviet leaders, that Nixon interacted with. When he was vice president, he was engaged in the famous kitchen debate in mid-1959 with Nikita Khrushchev. Remember, this is life-size. He was a small man, but he was built like a Mack truck, and believe me, he was full of energy. This is Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev ultimately would have the sort of historical reputation of being rather ill. The Soviets came to call his period the era of stagnation, but in fact he was a vigorous leader during the early 70s, and it was he as much as Nixon, who pushed for détente between the Soviet Union and the United States. Here to my left, we have a conversation that never happened. Sadat never had a conversation with Golda Meir. Golda Meir was Prime Minister of Israel. Sadat, of course, was Nasser's successor as the president of the United Arab Republic, or Egypt. Very important characters in Nixon's history. Nixon is president during the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. It's in that period, in October 73, first of all, that the United States and Israel were both taken by surprise when Egypt and Syria and Jordan attacked Israel. Israel was caught off guard and in the early going was in military trouble. The United States responded. The United States responded by sending 7 days after the invasion a massive airlift that Richard Nixon okayed, symbolizing this country's commitment to the state of Israel. For Israelis, what the United States did in October 73 was the greatest symbol of this country's commitment to Israel's independence. So these two leaders symbolized the Yom Kippur War, and then in the last year of Nixon's administration, as he was desperately looking for some political triumphs, he went to Egypt, he went to the Arab world, he went to Syria, he met Assad in Syria, and he went to meet with Sadat. In the beginnings of the relationship with the Egyptians that would lead to the famous Camp David Accord between Begin and Sadat when Jimmy Carter was president were laid in the Nixon administration. Over here, we have three titans from Europe. The first, of course, is Winston Churchill, whom Richard Nixon had met when he was vice president. Churchill, by the mid-50s, he was premier again of Great Britain, prime minister, after his wartime premiership. He was a little on the soft side, but he was still representative of the great lion who had stood up against Nazi aggression in World War II. De Gaulle, I believe, it's in Nixon's writings, de Gaulle was perhaps the leader he most admired. In many ways, de Gaulle was the man that Nixon had hoped would be his mentor in Europe. But de Gaulle would die early in the first term of Nixon's administration, and therefore that relationship that Nixon had wanted never came to pass. But Nixon did meet with him on his first trip to Europe in 1969. This is Konrad Adenauer. Konrad Adenauer was the first chancellor of West Germany, and Adenauer had been a staunch opponent of the Nazi regime. He had in fact been imprisoned by the Gestapo briefly. And he was a symbol of the new Germany. Nixon knew him from his vice presidential period. So these three men represented for him the new Europe, the post-war Europe that the United States helped reconstruct and then ultimately helped defend against the Soviet Union.
Next call, North Attleboro, Massachusetts. Good evening.
Hi, how are you this evening?
Good.
I noticed the derogatory nature with which, Mr. Nixon spoke of the Supreme Court justices to Mr. Hoover, and I was just wondering, might they have been privy to any of these tapes, or, were they just locked in a file at that point?
Mr. Smith.
I'm not sure if you mean were the justices privy?
Yeah.
Well, ironically, of course, the case that in some ways doomed the Nixon presidency involved 64 tapes that the Watergate special prosecutor wanted. And in the summer of 1974, Nixon had invoked the doctrine of executive privilege to try to keep those tapes out of the hands of the Watergate special prosecutor's office. And the Supreme Court, including several of his own appointees, ruled unanimously that the doctrine of executive privilege did not apply where a potential criminal conspiracy was involved.
Westchester, Pennsylvania. Go ahead, please.
When Richard Nixon ran against JFK, he lost by a very small vote. Richard Nixon never contested that election, it's my understanding. Could you give us some insight into why he did not contest the election?
Mr. Smith?
Well, that's a very good question. The debate goes on as to whether, particularly in the states of Illinois and Texas, which were carried, as you've indicated, by very narrow margins, Mayor Daley in Illinois, and Texas was Texas in those days. There were those, including the Republican National Chairman, Thurston Moore, and even Dwight Eisenhower, for example, had suggested that maybe his vice president should contest this. Nixon seems to have given it some consideration, but not much. He thought that it could tear the tear the country apart. The cynics say that Republicans in downstate Illinois may have stolen as many votes as Democratic, the machine in Chicago. But I think it really does testify to Nixon's character and a certain degree of self-sacrifice.
Last call for this segment. Baltimore, Maryland, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
No, I'm scared. No.
Hello.
Hello.
You're on the air.
I visited the Nixon Museum in July of '05. I'm interested in how the museum has changed since Deep Throat revealed his identity.
Tim Natale.
Well, the museum is going to change completely. In 2005, it was owned and operated by a private Nixon Foundation, which had a different mission from the National Archives. We are developing a nonpartisan interactive museum. In fact, one of the things we've done is, in consultation with the foundation, we had the Watergate exhibit dismantled, and we're working on a new one. I believe later in the program we will be discussing that.
By the way, what was wrong with the Watergate display under the other regime?
Well, it presented Watergate from only President Nixon's perspective. And this is a museum paid for by the, right now, this is a library paid for by the American people. This is not a Republican library. This is not a Democratic library. This belongs to everyone. Everybody's tax dollars goes to this library, and therefore our exhibits have to reflect history.
One of the biggest selling items in any presidential library is the Elvis T-shirt out there at that library. You've got an Elvis story for us, Tim Natale. Tell us.
Well, and now for something completely different. We have some remarkable things to show about this, and let's start by viewing something. Our curator, Olivia Anastasiadis, is going to show a phenomenal piece that we have here in Yorba Linda.
Hi. This here is a World War II commemorative Colt 45 gun. Actually, it's a semi-automatic weapon, and it was given to President Nixon by Elvis Presley on his visit to the White House in December of 1970. And the curious thing about it was that Elvis talked about a gift to the president in a letter that he had written on American Airlines stationery when he was en route to visit with the president. And the story goes that he had brought it to the Northwest Gate, and the Secret Service were just up in arms. You can't take a firearm into the Oval Office. So the gun was nicely taken away, and Elvis Presley was able to be taken into the Oval Office and meet with the president.
Tim Natale, we've got some oral history with a fellow named Jerry Schilling and Bud Krogh. Can you tell us what that is? And we'll show that. We're going to have a break, and then we'll come back with the second half.
Okay. We decided to bring together the two surviving participants in the Elvis-Nixon meeting of December 1970. Jerry Schilling was a longtime member of the Memphis Mafia. He had actually just left Elvis's employ when Elvis pulled him back to go on this incredible journey to Washington to deliver a letter to Richard Nixon. Eagle Bud Krogh, who you'll hear, was the staffer on the White House side who was given the job of actually bringing Elvis in to meet with Richard Nixon when it was decided that perhaps Elvis should be able to deliver his letter in person. An improbable meeting, and a meeting that was kept secret for over 10 years. It's amusing because if you think about the administration's concern about image, how much better for Nixon's image, Richard Nixon's image, it would have been if he had actually admitted to having met Elvis Presley in '70. But we wouldn't know about it until long after he had left office. But now listen to Schilling and Bud Krogh talk about their experience and see how oral history can knit together a period, a moment that otherwise would be lost in time.
The driver, the limousine driver, it took us to, I forgot which gate it was, North Gate, White House Gate, and Elvis said, "Jerry, just stay here. I'm going to take this to the guards at the gate." And I said, "Fine." Well, I'm keeping a pretty close eye on Elvis. And he gets out, and, the world knows what he was wearing, It was pretty normal for me, but, he had a high-collar top coat, His hair was a little longer than usual. He had a cane, and it's not full daylight. And he jumps out of the back of a black limousine. The White House security guards were pretty stiff, and I think they were, you know, like, who is this? What is this? I see it's not going well, so I jump out of the limousine and I go, excuse me, gentlemen, but, this is Mr. Elvis Presley. He just wanted to drop off this letter to the president. And they immediately, their whole demeanor changed.
Well, what was so amazing to me was after the Secret Service man opened the door to the Oval Office, I ushered him in to the office, and Elvis just stopped. Now, here's a man who had entertained millions of people all over the world, and I thought that he'd be right at home and feel very comfortable in the Oval Office, but such was not the case. I mean, he looked up in the ceiling and he saw eagles emblazoned in the ceilings. In the ceiling, he saw eagle in the carpet and the floor, eagles festooning the service flags to the right of the president's desk, and it was like, oh my gosh, here I am, a poor boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, in the Oval Office. Well, I had to sort of nudge him across the room over to the president's desk. Out came his badges from different law enforcement departments around the country, a picture of Priscilla, his wife, a picture of Lisa Marie, and then we began show and tell in the Oval Office. And they talked about how Elvis could help the drug program, basically help us with a number of things, how to reach young people with the dangers of drugs. And then he asked the president, can you get me a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics? The president looked at me and said, Bud, can we get him a badge? I said, sir, if you want to get him a badge, we can do that. He said, well, see that he gets one. Elvis was so overwhelmed with this, he stepped forward, grabbed the president with his left arm, and hugged him. Now, hugging was not the norm in the Oval Office, at least in my experience. And after that, his bodyguards came in.
President Nixon came over kind of like a guy's guy, hit me on the arm and said, Elvis, you got a couple of big ones here. And he said, you guys play football? And we talked a little bit about football. And
the president went behind his desk to give them gifts, which is customary, opened the bottom left-hand drawer, and one of my abiding memories is of Elvis Presley realizing that's where the gold was, going behind the desk, rooting through the drawer with the president, both of them, coming up with gifts, and then Elvis saying, Mr. President, remember, they have wives.
And he goes, Mr. President, he called him Mr. President. He said, Mr. President, they have wives too. And the president said, oh, well, let's see what we can, let's see what we can find. He walks back over to his desk, and he's rummaging around. This is how comfortable Elvis felt. Elvis is rummaging in the president's desk with him, looking for things for our wives.
And out came the gifts for girls and sweethearts and wives. They left loaded down. In fact, they'd done all their Christmas shopping in a 5-minute trip into the Oval Office.
You're watching C-SPAN's Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, a unique look at 12 of America's modern presidents, using rarely seen film and video, revealing a new perspective of these men. Tonight's program will continue in a moment, and you can watch this program in its entirety later here on C-SPAN at 11 p.m. Eastern, and hear more about tonight's president with additional audio recordings and interviews with noted historians tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio, XM Satellite Radio Channel 132. And for more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries.
Next Friday, C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries History Uncovered will be live from the Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We'll show you never-before-seen interviews of the former president, sharing his thoughts on the pardon of Richard Nixon, the 2 assassination attempts on his life, and his political battles with Ronald Reagan during the 1976 election campaign. That's live next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN.
We know that people are feeling frustrated and disillusioned with a lot of things about American politics these days, and many of those frustrations are very well placed.
Sunday on C-SPAN's Q&A, Michael Oreskes, co-author of The Genius of America, how the Constitution saved our country and why it can again.
Part of the answer to addressing those frustrations is to reconnect with the most brilliant political document ever written.
Author and International Herald Tribune executive editor Michael Oreskes. Sunday night at 8 on C-SPAN's Q&A. You can also listen to Q&A on C-SPAN Radio exclusively on XM satellite radio. It's also online as a C-SPAN podcast. We now continue with our visit to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, exploring the life and career of our 37th president.
Welcome back to our program on Richard Nixon. You're looking at the video of the 37th president at the White House wedding of his daughter Tricia. Tonight we're focusing on the collections of the Nixon Library, both from Yorba Linda, California, and College Park, Maryland. We begin the second part of our program with Nixon Library Director Tim Naftali as he takes us on a taped tour of the Artifacts Vault in College Park, Maryland.
We're now in College Park at our facility at A2. The Nixon Library is divided between the collection here in College Park, Maryland, and the library itself in Yorba Linda, California. What you see around you is something extremely unusual. You normally wouldn't see this, but then there's nothing really usual about the Nixon Library. Here you have the head of state gifts and the domestic gifts received by President and Mrs. Nixon and some of their associates during the Nixon administration. Those gifts were wrapped up and put away in storage after President Nixon resigned, and for the most part, have never been exhibited anywhere. So once they get to Yorba Linda, we will be able to exhibit these for the very first time. And we're talking about gifts, and we'll be looking at a few, that range from textiles to jewelry to folk art. Anything given to a President of the United States by anyone is cataloged, preserved, and then put away for ultimate display at a presidential library. So let's start with some remarkable pieces. In 1973, an international convention to protect endangered animals made the importation or sale of ivory illegal. President Nixon is the last president to have been able to receive ivory as gifts. And we have perhaps the best collection of ivory, presidential ivory, anywhere. You will see some ivory here. There's some other ivory in the remainder of the vault. This particular piece comes from the government of South Vietnam. Other pieces come from African governments. This collection is of pieces of solid ivory shaped like fruit. And these were a present from the Emperor of the Central African Republic, the infamous Bokassa. All of these pieces will ultimately be on display in Yorba Linda. I'm just giving you a smattering of some of my favorite pieces and the favorite pieces of the archivists. Here are some examples of folk art and gifts from the public. This is a footprint of a dinosaur from the Triassic period. This footprint was discovered by two high school students in Livingston, New Jersey in 1972. Here is a little folk art, a gift from an American citizen to President Nixon. Of course, it's a milk jug, and this is a milk jug that celebrates his trip to China and the possibilities of peace from his triangular diplomacy. Here we have two different kinds of gifts. On the right-hand side, you have, again, some folk art from a lady in New Jersey. Oh, this one actually, I'm sorry. This one is from a gentleman from Orlando, Florida. And the title of this piece is perfectly clear. It's perfectly clear. There's a cube. He's looking into the cube. And the cube or he, or either one is making it perfectly clear. That arrived to the White House in 1972, actually, during the campaign of 72. On the left is a remarkable head of state gift. This is real malachite, green malachite, and it comes from General Mobutu of the Congo. This is a gift to Mrs. Nixon, and the First Ladies cannot keep these gifts. Whenever something is given to either the President or the First Lady, it is cataloged and put away. They may be able to wear it on ceremonial occasions, but at the end of the administration, it's returned to it's given to the National Archives. So here is a present from General Mobutu of the Congo. Perhaps the most beautiful head of state gifts that we have are from Africa. And this is jewelry, pure gold, from the government of Côte d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast. This is pure gold. You have here a pendant and a bracelet. We have other gold jewelry. This is just representative of some of what we have, and I felt this was, and the archivists agree with me, this is perhaps the most stunning of the gold jewelry, but there's quite a bit of gold jewelry from Africa that President and Mrs. Nixon were given. Now, not everything is jewelry or a gem. It could be a gem of a different kind. This is a gift from a private citizen, a Pakistani gentleman, who was struck by the election of President Nixon and decided to give him what he called Nixon's multi-man personality. And this is a depiction of Nixon's various personalities as seen by this gentleman from Lahore, Pakistan. Nixon, Churchill of America, commanding appearance, friend of the world, Nixon peacemaker, Nixon judicious, and Nixon intellectual. Much of our collection has been packed and is ready for shipment to Yorba Linda, but we have a few things that we've put out just for you to look at today. Remember that the Nixon administration occurred in the 70s. Think about the colors of the 70s. If you've seen that 70s show, you've been reminded of it if you didn't live through that era. This is a perfect representation of the 1970s. This is from a lady in Mississippi, Mrs. Adair. This was sent to the White House in December of 1971. So it's just after Tricia Nixon married Edward Cox in a celebrated and beautiful wedding ceremony. You can see Edward Cox and Tricia on the left. You can see the president and King Timoho, his dog, in the foreground. There, of course, is the president and Pat Nixon. Julie and David Eisenhower on the right. And then various mythical beings that do not, animals that do not live on the south lawn of the White House. There was something psychedelic about this image that I felt really captured the era. And again, it's representative of rows of this kind of folk art that has been given to the president. Now, we move from American folk art to some Russian fine art. This was a gift from the Kremlin, from Brezhnev, Podgorny, and Kosygin, the three top leaders of the Soviet Union at the time that Richard Nixon was in office. These are the three leaders during the period of détente between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is a vision at dusk of Moscow. This is the Moscow River. This painting was a gift during the second summit. This is a gift from Pope Paul VI to Richard Nixon. Nixon, just after his inauguration, went to Europe on an extended tour. And one of the places he visited was the Vatican, and he returned in Air Force One with this. This is St. Peter's, of course, it's St. Peter's Basilica. The painting dates from the 17th century. This is another beautiful piece of ivory. As I said, we have many pieces of ivory. And we're coming up to my favorite of all of these gifts. I mean, the piece from Mobutu is beautiful, and the jewelry from the Ivory Coast is stunning. And what complements, by the way, the jewelry from the Ivory Coast is some remarkable textiles that we have from Africa. Now, those have already been packed, so I can't show them today. But eventually, we'll have a remarkable show of African textiles. Just remarkable, because the preservation staff at the National Archives have maintained these items so that they retain their color. And they have wonderful dyes and wonderful colors. So you'll have that remarkable group. But not every gift is that serious. In fact, I have a gift here on my left that I haven't the foggiest idea what to do with. Just because I'm director of the library doesn't mean I know where everything should go. And this particular gift, which I love, is one that, well, I'd love your suggestions as to what to do with it. Make those kind suggestions, please. This is a very large clamshell. This was a gift from the Philippine ambassador to the United States to President and Mrs. Nixon. This is a crated. I kind of take it out of the crate. It's going to find its way to Yorba Linda, and I haven't the foggiest idea what to do with it. It would make a nice fountain. We could use it as a table, I suppose. No, I'm just kidding, because in fact, it's an artifact. What's going to surprise many of you, and I think you've noticed this as you watch the series about presidential libraries, is that when something is given to the National Archives, when it's given to a president, it's treated as you would treat the rarest piece of a museum collection. So this clam is an artifact, and we have to find an appropriate way to display it in Yorba Linda. As I said, I'm looking forward to your suggestions.
The voice of Tim Naftali, the director of the President Nixon Library in Yorba Linda. That, though, was in College Park, right out here in the suburbs. On the screen, President Nixon is meeting with his cabinet officers. William Rogers is Secretary of State there on the right. And we're moving into another segment here of some oral history with John Mitchell and Leonard Garment. The subject, tell us more about this segment, Richard Norton Smith.
Well, first of all, John Mitchell, who was a very prominent name in the history of the Nixon administration, Attorney General. And it's appropriate that we're looking at footage of the cabinet because every president wants to have at least one person in the cabinet who is his guy. John Kennedy famously made his brother Bobby Attorney General. Nixon didn't know many members of his cabinet. He didn't have long-standing relationships with them. He did with John Mitchell. John Mitchell was at the law firm in New York to which Nixon relocated in 1963 after his defeat in the race for governor of California. He was a bond lawyer, expert on municipal finance, tough guy, very knowledgeable guy, and someone who had actually been around the political process because of his work in municipal finance, particularly in New York. John Mitchell becomes first campaign manager. Well, no, he becomes a campaign manager in 1968, then Attorney General, and then, of course, the head of the committee to re-elect the president in 1972. Len Garment is also at the law firm of Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander. And in his own words, is a liberal Jew from New York and someone who illustrates, I think, something that may surprise people, the diversity of Nixon's closest associates. Garment would come down to Washington, eventually go into the White House, was very involved with school desegregation, the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities, and other policies, never really got into the inner circle, and as a result was spared the stigma of Watergate.
The gentleman that we have had here at C-SPAN during this last year working on this and doing all the research at the libraries, working with people like Tim Naftali and his staff, Eric Nelson, who we appreciate every week as we see some of this stuff for the first time. This is an oral history interview Tim Naftali did with Len Garment. It's 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Mitchell was a very interesting, very good man. Strong character who was very good at politics and very bad at measuring his own capabilities. And with the assistance of Richard Nixon, made him what was a fatal mistake, which was being persuaded to take on the Attorney General post. He was completely unqualified for that job, particularly since he was also president's primary political advisor. I mean, it was conflict of interest and a marriage of incompatible qualities of a historic nature. And that was the way his history, and perhaps the history of the Nixon presidency, was written, because you can follow that line all the way down to Watergate, and you find that he had lost his capacity for independent action by then as a result of the mistakes he made in this mixed role of political advisor and attorney general. He's a very good man. I mean, he was, and he tried. He wanted to do the right thing. He was burdened by a wife who was sick, who had not only a drinking problem, but had a kind of a related mania that drove Mitchell somewhat crazy and contributed to his episodes of instability. And he was indispensable to the election of Richard Nixon, probably both times, and he was a major contributing cause to the collapse of the Nixon presidency.
Tim Naftali, in Yorba Linda, Martha Mitchell is who Len Garment was referring to. Yeah. Do you have anything in the library that you've seen that we could, I mean, I know we don't have it tonight, but is there anything on Martha Mitchell, what she looks like, what she sounds like, and how important was she to this story?
Well, she's very important to understanding John Mitchell. They had a celebrated love affair, and her personal collapse, really, undermined his ability, it distracted him. And many people in our oral histories refer to the personal strain on Mitchell. Some argue that that's why he gave the go-ahead for Operation Gemstone, for the political espionage operation that would include, among other things, breaking into the Watergate Hotel and office complex. One of the things that's really important to understand is that when Len Garment is asked by the president to be his lawyer near the end of the administration, Garment and President Nixon have a one-on-one conversation, and the president assures Garment that he did not participate in covering up the break-in. He says, I wasn't involved in the break-up, I did not order it, and I didn't cover it up. What we're about to hear is the tape of a conversation that, when it's revealed on August 5th of 1974, makes clear to a lot of people that President Nixon engaged in a cover-up after the break-in on June 17th, 1972. And people like Len Garment would be shocked when they heard this tape. This tape is of a conversation that comes only 6 days after the break-in. And there, both Ehrlichman and Mitchell and John Dean are thinking about what to do. And Mitchell and John Dean come up with this idea. What we should do is we should get the FBI to stop its investigation of the Cuban burglars, the Cuban-American burglars who were actually captured the night of June 17th. What we should do is we should tell the FBI that, in fact, this is a CIA operation and they should back off. And we should get the CIA to do our bidding, to be the one to go to the FBI, to acting FBI Director Patrick Gray, someone who had replaced J. Edgar Hoover, who had died the year before, to get Gray to have Gray back off when Richard Helms, who was then Director of Central Intelligence, said to him, sorry, this is actually a CIA operation, covert operation, and frankly, Justice Department, FBI should just stand away from it. This is what happens in the Oval Office when this idea about how to get the FBI to stop investigating the money and the other elements of the story that would make clear White House involvement, how the FBI is to be handled, and here the idea, the proposal is made to Richard Nixon, and it's Richard Nixon's response that would cause him such political trouble 2 years later.
That's fine. Now, on the investigation, the Democratic break-in thing, we're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control because Gray doesn't exactly know how to control it. And their investigation is now leading into some productive areas because they've been able to trace the money, not through the money itself, but through the bank, sources, and the banker itself, and it goes some directions we don't want it to go. Also, there have been some things like an informant came in off the street to the FBI in Miami where there's a photographer who has a friend who's a photographer who developed some films for this guy Barker. And the films had pictures of Democratic National Committee letterhead documents and things. So there's things like that that are filtering in. Mitchell came up with yesterday, and John Dean analyzed very carefully last night and concurs now with Mitchell's recommendation that the only way to solve this, and we're set up beautifully to do it, in that the only network that paid any attention to last night was NBC, who did a massive story on the Cuban thing and all. But the way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and just say, stay the hell out of this. There's some business here we don't want you going any further. That's not an unusual development. And that would take care of that. He doesn't want to. Pat does want to. He doesn't know how to, and he doesn't have any basis for doing it. Given this, he will then have the basis. He'll call Mark Bell in, and the two of them. And Mark Bell wants to cooperate because he's ambitious. They'll call them in and say, "We've gotten the signal across the river to put the hold on this," and that'll fit rather well because the FBI agents who are working the case at this point feel that's what it is the CIA. But they're tracing the money to them. Well, they've traced it to a name, but they haven't got to the guy yet. Somebody here, Ken Dahlberg, and the else Ken Dahlberg said he gave $25,000 in Minnesota. And, well, the check went directly in to this guy, Barker. Maybe he's, he did, this is from the committee, always saying, it's directly traceable. There's some more through some Texas people that went to the Mexican bank, which they can also trace through the Mexican bank. They'll get their names today. And, well, there's no way I'm just thinking, if they don't cooperate, what do they say? They were approached by the Cubans, and that's what Dahlberg has to say, and the Texans too, if they will. But then we're relying on more and more people all the time. It's the problem. And they'll stop if we take this other step. And they seem to be able to think is to get them to stop. All right, fine. And they say the only way to do that is the White House instruction. And that it's got to be to Helms and what's his name? Walters. And the proposal would be that Irwin and I call him in. All right, fine. And say, how do you call him in? Because, well, we protected Helms on one hell of a lot of things. That's what everything starts. This is hunt. That'll uncover a lot of legal mad scandals, a lot of things. And then we just feel that this would be very detrimental to have this thing going further. This involves the Cubans and hunt and a lot of hanky-panky that we have nothing to do with ourselves. What the hell did Mitchell know about this thing? I think so. I don't think he knew the details, but I think he didn't know how it was going to be handled with Dahlberg and Texas and so forth. Well, who is the asshole that did that? Is it Liddy
On your screen is a videotape of the president's diary from June 23rd, excuse me, 1972. Tim Naftali, did the language the president uses on that tape, did he realize it someday? Did he think that it was going to be exposed at some point?
Not at all. In fact, President Nixon, from February of 1971 through July of 1973, had a sound-activated taping system. It captured everything that occurred in the Oval Office. He also had one room in Camp David. He had his telephones wired. He had his secretive office in the old Executive Office building wired. That's why we have 3,800 hours of tape. Richard Nixon never expected the tapes to be made public. And why did he believe that? Because he wasn't the first president to tape. From Franklin Roosevelt on, every president had, to one extent or another, taped. Indeed, there are 280 hours of John F. Kennedy tapes that have survived, and Lyndon Johnson, who in fact had shown Richard Nixon his taping system, left over 800 hours of tapes. And until the revelation of the Nixon tapes, none of those tapes were made public. So Richard Nixon was pretty confident that nobody would ever get to hear the June 23rd, 72 conversation.
Tim, I'd like to ask you, do you have a theory as to why Nixon in February of 71, what was it about that period in the Nixon presidency that led him to install this system?
Hey, I don't need a theory, Richard. We've interviewed the people who actually installed the system. It's amazing. The reason he puts the system in is that he is competing with Kissinger. He's afraid that when the presidency is over, that people will think that Kissinger was the source of his great foreign policy ideas. So he's saying, I want to prove to people that I'm the reason for these great foreign policy breakthroughs. Because remember, Richard, in February of 1971, we're on the cusp of him going to China, announcing that he's going to go to China. We're on the cusp of him starting détente with the Soviet Union, and he's the one pushing for them. So he says to his people, to Haldeman and the Secret Service, I want to wire this place so that when I write my memoirs, I have the detailed proof that it's me and not Kissinger who's behind the structure of peace.
If you're listening to the radio, it's Tim Naftali's voice. He's the director of the President Nixon Library at Yorba Linda, and we need to set up this next one. Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian. It's only 2 minutes and 36 seconds, but it's a campaign video.
Yeah, and this is remarkable in a couple of ways. First of all, as a historical curiosity, this was a film made for the 1972 Republican Convention. It just so happens that the filmmaker showed up on June 23rd, 1972. Needless to say, this did not show up in the final film. But it's even more significant because the 1972 Republican Convention is the first in a long series to be totally scripted. Any spontaneity was purely orchestrated. And if you notice, conventions today have turned into infomercials. It really began in 1972 with this convention and in many ways with this film.
The 37th President of the United States is Richard Nixon. We know him best as a public figure. We seldom glimpse the President behind the scenes. But now we shall take measure of the man as he works, gather insight from those who know him best. See revealed something of the man whose vision guides the nation, whose actions affect the world. The President must be jealous of his time. The function of his staff is to assist the decision-making process.
And then get Ehrlich in a minute. Is he around? Yes, sir, he's upstairs.
What they bring to him must be pertinent and concise, ready for his decision. The President is tough-minded, straight to the point when the occasion demands, as in this discussion of revenue sharing.
We don't have any assurance that if we put federal money into that reform, that property taxes are going to go down in the localities.
Well, then we won't accept it. What's the matter with these clowns?
Well, it's a question of local option. You remember, you've got a lot of local government people on that commission.
The whole purpose of this is to get property taxes down. The purpose of this is not to increase the budgets for local officials to continue to raise property taxes.
That's what I thought.
And unless you put the heat on these local officials, they'll just take the money and pour it into all their pet projects and not get the projects.
That's what's happening.
Not the way it's going to be. We ought to have a recruiting program at the high school and college level, not just for these symbolistic jobs. We don't want to have basically a White House Mexican or a White House Negro or a White House woman and so forth. That's what everybody else has done. I mean, this whole jazz about the effect that, well, there ought to be a woman in the cabinet or a Mexican in the cabinet or an Italian in the cabinet. That isn't what matters. What matters is that whoever a person is, he's got to feel, whatever his background is, he's got a chance to come into government and is welcome because, again, it's for the interests of the country. Minority groups traditionally have felt that in government they were limited to what are called basically the menial tasks, and they end up pushing a cart or delivering mail or licking envelopes. The major incentive for individual coming to government is that he's got to look at the top and say, gee, I might get there. I might have a chance.
There's the front of the Nixon Library, and that was videotape prepared by the Republican Party for the convention in 1972, right in and around the time period of the Watergate break-in. And Tim Naftali, are there still documents to come on the Watergate?
Well, we released some remarkable documents this summer as part of the agreement negotiated between the Archivist of the United States, Alan Weinstein, and John Taylor of the Nixon Foundation. The Nixon Foundation deeded to the American people the documents that Richard Nixon had won through court cases in the 1980s and early 1990s. Among those were documents deemed political, which had actually been in the National Archives facility and then were moved out to Yorba Linda. We now have them back. They're under National Archives control, and I have in front of me two remarkable documents that we released to the public on July 11th when this facility became a presidential library. I say remarkable because in the testimony before the White House Special Prosecutor and also before the Senate, these kinds of documents were described as having been destroyed. But these survived. These are the handwritten notes of Gordon Strachan, who was an aide to Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. The way it worked was that Strachan would meet with people, would write down what they said to him, they'd type up a report and give it to Haldeman. Haldeman was a master of paper flow, so too was Nixon. He liked things written down. Well, the typed up memos were destroyed, but the drafts remained. And here is a document from April 4th of 1972, which records a meeting between Jeb Magruder, who was Mitchell's number 2 at the committee to re-elect President Nixon, and Strachan. And it's in this meeting that, among many things, Strachan says to, Magruder says to Strachan, regarding the Liddy operation, there's approval for 2 operations, not 4. One of those operations was Gemstone, which would include the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate. This is evidence that the White House, Strachan works for Haldeman, was told that Mitchell had approved Liddy's plan. Now, it does not say how much, we can't tell from this fragmentary note, how much of the operation was described to Strachan, nor, because of the lack of other evidence, nor do we know what Strachan exactly told Haldeman. But here it is. The reference to Liddy is the Liddy operation, which we also know as Gemstone. Now, here's a document from April 14th, 1972, that documents a discussion between Haldeman and Strachan, which Strachan would testify to before the Senate Watergate Committee. Before the Senate Watergate Committee, he said, Haldeman told me to shift the political espionage apparatus, which include breaking and entering, from Muskie, who had just lost the Wisconsin primary, to McGovern, who had won the Wisconsin primary. And here you can see Liddy switch missions from Muskie to McGovern. This actually is what Strachan testified to, but it's evidence that for the Haldeman people, the Haldeman group, Liddy was a known quantity, his political espionage was understood, and the fact that it had been approved was known in the White House. What Richard Nixon knew, we can't tell from these fragmentary notes, but this is the first time we've had evidence quite like this.
Richard Smith, Pat Buchanan.
Well, I'll tell you, this doesn't need much of a setup. Pat Buchanan, who was one of the speechwriters, one of Nixon's three chief speechwriters, and always very much the guy, the go-to guy for red meat for the conservatives. I simply asked Pat Buchanan, how did you find out about the Watergate break-in?
I got a phone call.
Did you?
It was on a Saturday, and I got a phone call from Ken Kachigian. And he said...
And Ken Kachigian was?
Ken Kachigian worked with me, and he was a political guy. He was on my liaison to the committee. And he and I worked on memos on political strategy and writing, and he was in the writing shop. And he called me on a Saturday, and his voice was a little sick, and he said, they caught 5 guys in the Democratic committee last night. And I said, oh no, because we had been getting, Kachigian and I had been getting, and Ken was sending it in to me, materials, photographs of documents out of Muskie's campaign and things. And I was surprised. You get Xerox stuff all over the place, but this was photographs. I said, where's this coming from? He said, well, it's a chauffeur up there, and apparently he's working for us. And I thought, oh my gosh, these guys have broken in. They're telling us it's a chauffeur, and they've broken in and gotten it. Fortunately, they had not. And what the story we had was true. But I knew it was our guys in a second. In a second.
Secaucus, New Jersey, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this is for Mr. Smith. Two questions, sir. The first question is, Richard Nixon lost the presidential election at Kennedy in 1960, and he emerges as a Republican nominee in 1968. My question is, why would the Republicans choose Nixon again after he lost in 1960? And the other question I have is, when Nixon chose Ford as a vice president, did he know that he was going to resign at that point, or had an inkling he was going to resign and thought Ford was the best candidate to succeed him as president? Thank you.
Well, those are two very good questions. Let me take the second one first. In fact, it's just the opposite. Quite frankly, he regarded Jerry Ford as his insurance, just as earlier he had regarded Spiro Agnew as his insurance. Ford was not his first choice. John Connally, the former Texas governor and Secretary of the Treasury, was the man that Nixon would have nominated if he could have confirmed him. So, now as for your first question as to why the Republicans nominated him in 1968, there are a number of reasons. First of all, he had, in 1966, campaigned very vigorously, very successfully. That had been a big Republican year. He had piled up a lot of IOUs. But beyond that, there was a sense, particularly as the Vietnam War ground on and the Cultural Revolution of the 60s were beginning to shift public attitudes on issues like law and order, for example. Nixon was the man who managed to define the middle of the Republican Party. Nelson Rockefeller was too far to the left. Ronald Reagan at that point was too far to the right. Nixon actually, and he went into the primaries in '68 and swept the primaries. And so actually, by the time he got to Miami, he was almost the inevitable choice.
Vestal, New York, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you for this great series. It's really very educational. Could you clarify, wasn't this the administration that after all the legal battles over everything that of what had happened in the White House, wasn't this the administration where everything changed about what could be archived, what was the personal property of the people leaving the White House, and what was the property of the people? And then there's a second part to my question, too. Do you want that now?
Sure.
Okay, the second part is, and it relates to the family of the president. And I remember on Larry King, the two Nixon daughters were on Larry King after President Nixon had passed. And they both differed tremendously on how they felt the library should handle, especially the controversial matters. And what artifacts of the families belong to the archives, and what is able to leave the White House?
Mr. Smith, can you, the first part of that was...
Well, yeah, in a nutshell, basically, you're absolutely right. After Richard Nixon, Congress passed something called the Presidential Records Act, the Presidential Materials Act, in any event, 1978, and basically they impounded all of Richard Nixon's presidential papers. Up until then, presidents had essentially been free to take their papers with them. Nixon was sui generis. A law was passed. He, in fact, contested that for many years, and eventually, I believe his estate received something like $12 or $16 million. The courts basically upheld the law, but said that the estate was entitled to remuneration. And maybe Tim can talk more about the relationship with the daughters.
Do you know? He's not with us at the moment.
Okay.
Do you know anything about that relationship?
I don't. I know that there had been a period of at least some estrangement, apparently disagreement over the direction of the library. But my understanding is that they are very much on board with its coming into the federal system.
For Richard Norton Smith, we go to Fairfax, Virginia. Good evening.
Good evening. Two quick questions for Mr. Smith. What, if any, is there information about whether Vice President Agnew objected to being sort of put in charge of beating up the media in the early 70s? And secondly, what are is there any speculation by historians as to what is in the 18-minute gap in the Watergate tapes? Thank you.
Well, again, good questions. I don't think Spiro Agnew put up the least bit of resistance to beating up on the media. First of all, I think he rather enjoyed it. Secondly, it made him overnight a celebrity. You know, he had been a rather obscure governor of Maryland, and remember during the campaign, everyone said Spiro who? No one said Spiro who after his Des Moines speech in 1969. In terms of the 18-and-a-half-minute gap, sure, there's still speculation as to how it happened. It apparently involved more than one erasure. I'm not sure anyone really believes at this point that Rosemary Woods was responsible for the entire gap. But I also think it's, as I understand it, and I have not looked at this closely, my understanding is that there are contemporaneous Haldeman notes that others have used in order to reconstruct at least what we think the conversation was about.
Detroit, Michigan. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good evening. This is either for Mr. Naftali or Professor Smith. I was wondering about the chronology. You've touched on bits and pieces of this, but the chronology of why the Nixon Library remained outside of the library system for so long, why it took that 30-year period before it was constructed and put together, and if you could go into detail of why it remained out for so long, and if now there are any restrictions on the materials still.
Well, first of all, it was a nomadic institution from the beginning. There was talk at Duke University, where, of course, Richard Nixon had attended law school, and I believe the faculty opposed that. They looked at a site down at San Clemente, which had been the home of the summer White House. And eventually they wound up, I think, actually where they really should have been all along, next to the house. You know, remember Richard Nixon's memoir, I was born in a house my father built. And that house stands next to the library, and now President and Mrs. Nixon are interred on the grounds between them. So it seems like a very appropriate place to be. It stayed out of the system for a very long time because, like everything else about Richard Nixon, it was politically controversial. I think there were some doubts, quite frankly, on the part of some in the scholarly community about the willingness of those who had created the library to observe the same impartial scholarly standards that the National Archives would require. That test has been more than met, and now you have the library inside the system.
We watched early, as this program started, some video that had never been seen before. It was the 6 minutes before the president gave his August 8th, 1974 address to the nation resigning.
Yeah, very quickly, by the end of July, the House has, the Judiciary Committee has adopted 3 articles of impeachment. Simultaneously, the Supreme Court has ruled, as we said earlier, that Richard Nixon has to give up those 64 tapes. On August 1st, Alexander Haig, the White House Chief of Staff, hears the June 23rd tape that we've heard tonight, and he concludes that the ball game's over. That becomes public on August 5th. It's very clear that the president's support, even among Republicans, is crumbling. His family, which has displayed incredible fortitude throughout this, tries to talk him out of resigning, but he makes the decision that he will go. And he will announce that to the American people in a speech from the Oval Office at 9 o'clock Eastern Time on August 8th, 1974.
You're going to hear a couple of names. Ollie Atkins was the president's personal photographer in the White House, and you'll hear him referring to him. And also, I think you hear the voice of Bill Headline. who at the time worked for CBS. CBS had the pool, the only CBS cameras in the Oval Office. Bill Hedine went on to run the Bureau of CNN here in Washington for a lot of years. Let's watch.
Okay, how's that? Is that reading light hitting anywhere that you can see? I don't think it is. I got a barn door off, but it might.
Okay. Hey, you're better looking than I am. Why don't you stay here? Blondes, they say, photograph better than brunettes. That true or not? You are a blonde, aren't you? Redhead? We're the same. Oh, I will. I know. Have you got an extra camera in case the lights go out? Where? Who'd you get it from? Is that an NBC?
This is the camera. This is the primary camera.
Yeah.
And this is the backup camera.
And that's an NBC camera, I presume.
No, they're both CBS cameras.
I know. Standard joke. Let me see, did you get these lights properly? My eyes always have, you'll find if you get past 60, that's enough. Thanks. My friend Ollie always wants to take a lot of pictures. I'm afraid he'll catch me picking my nose. He wouldn't print that, would you, though, Ollie? Yeah. Now, you can take a long shot, but that's enough right now. I guess I can see it. Oh, you want a level, don't you? Yes, yes. Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of our nation. Any more? Each time, I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. Okay. Ollie? No, only the CBS crew now is to be in this room during this. Only the crew. No, there will be no picture. No, after the broadcast. You've taken your picture. Didn't you take one just now? That's it. Because, you know, we don't want to, we didn't let the press is going to take one, so you've taken it, and you just take it right now. This is right after the broadcast. You got it? Come on. Okay. Okay, fine. All right.
What I'm told, sir.
All right, fine. I'm not going to make the other photographers mad by giving you too many. That's enough, okay? Now, all Secret Service, is there any Secret Service in the room?
Just one agent.
Out. You don't have to stay, do you? You're required to? Okay. I'm just kidding you. I always try to get leave alone. How many we used to have more than one.
2 minutes to 15 seconds to air, please. 1 minute and a half.
I better get in position.
President, they'd like to move the pages from.
What?
They'd like to move the pages away from the microphones.
Well, if I can. I mean, it just depends whether I can see them. I'll try to. You mean move them like this? Would that help you? My straight in the back, would you mind checking my collar? Is it fine? I mean, it's not ruffled up. Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation.
Richard Norton Smith, what do you think?
Well, you know, for anyone who lived through it, and we did, I think it still has an impact akin to what maybe the Pearl Harbor generation or the Kennedy assassination has.
Tim Naftali, what do you think?
Again, it's just so ironic. This is a presidency that tried so hard to be scripted, and yet we have so much of this unguarded material, whether it's tapes or behind-the-scenes Super 8 movies or behind-the-scenes video. It's remarkable. It's a feast for historians and lovers of American history.
Oxford Union speech from 1978, Richard Norton Smith.
4 years later, 4 years after what you've just seen, Richard Nixon is making the ultimate comeback, the last campaign, as it were. He'd written his memoirs, he'd done the David Frost interviews, and he was more than edging back onto the end of the stage. He goes to Europe, and a very tough audience, the Oxford Union, a famous debating society, and in some ways this is emblematic, it seems to me, of Nixon's later years. The man famously, in his own words, in the arena, surrounded by a hostile audience to begin with. You can hear the chants of protesters outside, and yet by the time he's done, he's won this audience over, gets a standing ovation.
Wars for a great power, which are big wars, are tough, but when you have the country behind you, that's leadership. But for wars against a little power, when a country is divided, it's difficult. You hear these people outside, and it's not pleasant. I mean, I'm used to it. I've had to develop a little stronger voice as a result, but I'm used to it. But I never forget, you know, there are many moments that stick in your mind. This is sort of inconsequential. I went down to Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg. I think it was in 1971. To make a speech to a World Law Conference on world peace and that. And a very, very attractive girl. I would guess she was 16, 17. Sort of reminded me of my daughter when she was that age, my older daughter, who's blue-eyed and blonde. This girl was blue-eyed and blonde. And as I was walking in, she came right up against me, walking up to me, broke through the Secret Service line, and just spit right in my face. She said, "You murderer." Well, I borrowed a handkerchief from the Secret Service guy and wiped it off. I went in. It was about as hard a speech as I ever made. Because you don't want anybody. I don't mind, you know, adults saying, "I don't agree with you." I don't mind getting a few rocks thrown at me. I've had that too. I don't mind being cartooned. I may not like it, but I had a reason to fight back. But to have young people like this, to think that somebody who has been president is one who has not even tried to make a contribution to their lives, then you kind of think you're a failure. But let me say this. I did fail in the political area. I failed in handling a little thing, and by failing to handle it well, that colors everything that you did. But on the other hand, I feel that when it comes to the great goal of building a better world, that if we had not made the China Initiative, if we had not made the moves that we had toward the Soviet Union, even though it's pretty hairy and it's going to be some tough negotiation before it works out, I think the chances for a world of peace will be far less than they are. And for that, I have no apology.
Tim Naftali, we're out of time, but when you finish what you're doing there, will the image of Richard Nixon change at all, do you think?
I leave that up to other historians. My job is to make it possible to learn everything you need to know about Nixon. It's to make this a transparent and open place for debate and discussion. You will get more material. We have post-presidential material that our supervisory archivist, Gregory Cumming, has here to show. We've got 42 million pages of presidential material in College Park that will eventually come here to Yorba Linda. There are releases to come for years and 1,800 hours of tape with all kinds of new treasures. So I would say don't think the Nixon story is set. Expect a lot of Nixon revisionism. There is, I think the term is that Nixon is the gift that keeps on giving. And I can't wait to see what Americans and foreigners interested in that era make and do with this new type of stuff.
Thank you very much to you and your staff and the folks at College Park for all the help you've given us in getting this evening ready. And we hope to come back.
Our pleasure.
Hope to come back and see you soon. Richard Orton Smith, we move on after this to Gerald Ford. What's the connection here?
Well, of course, Richard Nixon exercised the 25th Amendment to the Constitution and made Gerald Ford his vice president at the end of 1973, not really believing that a few months later, less than a year later, he would be vacating the White House and making way, as that image suggests, for a most unlikely president.
Richard Nixon Presidential Library, and explores the life and Richard Nixon Presidential Library, and explores the life and career of our 37th president.
Okay, how's that? Is that reading light hitting anywhere that you can see? I don't think it is. I got a barn door off, but it might.
Okay. Hey, you're better looking than I am. Why don't you stay here? Blondes, they say, photograph better than brunettes. Let me see, did you get these lights properly? Yes, my eyes always have, you'll find if you get past 60, that's enough. Thanks. My friend Ollie always wants to take a lot of pictures. I'm afraid he'll catch me picking my nose. He wouldn't print that, would you, though, Ollie? Yeah. Now, you can take a long shot, but that's enough right now. I guess I can see it.